My name is Douglas. I am 69 years old, and I spent 40 years as a risk assessment officer for one of the largest banks in Seattle. My job was simple but brutal. I looked into people's eyes and determined if they were lying, if they were desperate, or if they were about to make a mistake that would cost them everything. You learn to see the cracks in a person's soul before they even open their mouths. But nothing in my career prepared me for the moment my phone rang while I was sitting at my son's dining table. It was Henderson, my neighbor, and a retired Marine who sees everything that happens on our street. His voice was trembling, a tone I had never heard from a man who had survived 2 wars. "Douglas, are you home right now?" "No," I whispered, gripping my fork. "I am having dinner at my son Brian's house." "Why?" There was a pause on the other end, heavy and terrifying. "Then who is inside your house right now? I see flashlights in your living room. They are taking the wall safe." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, but I didn't panic. I looked across the table. My son Brian was watching me, a smirk playing on his lips. He had heard the question through the speaker. Instead of concern, instead of anger, he threw his head back and laughed. It was a cruel, hollow sound. "Let them take it, Dad." Brian sneered, picking up his wine glass. "It is just a house full of old junk anyway. Maybe the rats are throwing a party." He laughed again, and in that split second, I saw the truth. I saw the setup, and I watched paralyzed by a mixture of horror and calculation as my son raised the glass to his lips, the glass that was meant for me, the glass I had secretly swapped 30 seconds earlier. He drank deep, swallowing the very poison his wife had prepared for my final toast. And as the liquid went down his throat, his laughter died. Before I tell you how my son ended up gasping for air on his own floor, I need to tell you how we got here. I need to tell you about the powder in the kitchen, the ice in the wine, and the silence of a father who realized he had raised a monster. If you are listening to this, like and subscribe, because what you are about to hear is a confession of survival. It started at 4 p.m. that afternoon. The rain in Seattle was relentless, a gray curtain that washed away the colors of the world. I was sitting in my study reviewing my old case files when my phone buzzed. It was Brian. My son had not invited me to dinner in 3 years. Our relationship consisted of brief transactional phone calls where he would invent a new emergency, a car repair, a medical bill, a gambling debt, and I would transfer the money. I knew he was drowning. I knew his wife Vanessa was a pharmacist with expensive tastes and cold eyes. But I kept giving because that is what fathers do. We give until we are empty. Dad Brian said, his voice too bright, too cheerful. "Vanessa and I were thinking. It has been too long. Come over for dinner tonight. She is making her special roast. We want to celebrate. Celebrate what I asked, my instincts already flaring. Just family, Dad. Just us. Please. Do it for me." I agreed, but as I hung up, I felt the familiar itch at the back of my neck. The same itch I felt when a client with a fake credit history sat across from my desk. I walked to my window and looked out at the street. My house was modest on the outside, a peeling Victorian that looked like it belonged to a pensioner living on Social Security. That was by design. Nobody knew about the basement. Nobody knew about the investments I had made in the 80s that had quietly compounded into a fortune. To Brian and Vanessa, I was just an old man sitting on a small pile of cash that they were desperate to inherit. I dressed in my usual worn cardigan and drove my 10-year-old sedan to their house. It was a modern build in a neighborhood they couldn't afford, with a leased luxury car in the driveway and a lawn that was overgrown. Signs of financial distress were everywhere, if you knew where to look. The peeling paint on the mailbox, the past due notice sticking out of the trash bin by the curb. When I entered, the house smelled of roast beef and something else, something sharp and chemical. "Douglas, so glad you could make it," Vanessa called out from the kitchen. I walked in. She was standing by the island, her back to me. She didn't hear my footsteps. I have always walked quietly. It is a habit from living alone. Over her shoulder, I saw her hands working furiously. She was using a mortar and pestle to crush several white tablets into a fine powder. Her movements were jerky, frantic. Beside her stood 2 glasses of red wine. They were identical crystal goblets. I cleared my throat. Vanessa jumped, spinning around so fast she nearly knocked the wine over. She swept the white powder into her palm and shoved her hand into her apron pocket. Her face was flushed, her eyes wide and terrified. "Dad," she stammered, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. "I didn't hear you come in. I was just crushing some aspirin. I have a terrible migraine." I looked at the counter. There were no aspirin bottles, but there was a small orange prescription bottle near the sink, partially hidden by a towel. I recognized the label color. It wasn't over-the-counter medicine. It looked like something controlled. "I hope you feel better," I said, keeping my voice flat. "Brian mentioned a celebration." "Yes," she said, breathless. "We are just so happy to see you. Go sit down. I will bring the wine." I walked into the dining room. Brian was sitting at the head of the table, tapping his foot nervously. He looked thinner than the last time I saw him. His eyes were bloodshot, darting around the room. "Hey, Dad," he said, not standing up to greet me. "Thanks for coming." "You seem anxious, Brian," I observed, pulling out the chair to his right. "Just work stress," he muttered. "Construction business is tough right now. But tonight is about relaxing. Tonight is about taking care of family." Taking care. The words sounded heavy, loaded with a double meaning I couldn't yet parse. Vanessa entered the room, carrying a tray. On it were the 2 glasses of red wine. One was placed in front of Brian. The other she placed in front of me with a deliberate, trembling hand. "For you, Douglas," she said. "A vintage Cabernet. We opened it just for you." I looked at the glass. The wine was dark rich, but floating on the surface were 3 ice cubes. I never drink red wine with ice. Brian knew that. Vanessa knew that. It was a cardinal sin for a wine lover. "Why the ice?" I asked. "Oh," Vanessa said quickly, her voice rising an octave. "It was a bit warm. I wanted to cool it down for you. It helps. It helps open the flavor." I stared at the ice cubes. They were melting fast, swirling in the red liquid. And then I realized, ice doesn't just cool wine. Ice creates agitation as it melts. It helps dissolve solids. It helps hide sediment. It helps hide powder. "Thank you, Vanessa," I said. I looked her dead in the eye. She blinked and looked away, rushing back to the kitchen to get the roast. Brian was busy looking at his phone under the table. He was texting someone. His thumbs were flying across the screen. I sat there, my heart hammering against my ribs. My mind was racing, analyzing the variables. The nervous invitation. The crushing of pills. The specific placement of the glass. The ice. It was a setup. They weren't just asking for money tonight. They were tired of asking. I needed to be sure. I needed to test the theory without ending up in the morgue. Brian dropped his fork. It clattered loudly onto the floor. "Damn it," he cursed, bending down under the table to retrieve it. At that exact moment, Vanessa was in the kitchen, her back turned, taking the roast out of the oven. The cat, a large tabby, jumped onto the counter, and she yelled at it, distracted. I had 3 seconds. I didn't think. I acted. My hand moved with the speed of a man who used to shuffle cards for a living in his 20s. I reached out, grabbed my glass, and switched it with Brian's. They were identical. Same fill level. Same ice. I pulled my hand back and folded my arms just as Brian resurfaced from under the table with his fork. Vanessa walked in with the roast, placing it in the center of the table. She sat down opposite me. She didn't look at the food. She looked at my glass. "Let's toast," she said, her voice tight. "To family." Brian picked up the glass in front of him. The glass that was originally mine. The glass with the powder. To family, Brian echoed. I picked up my glass. I brought it to my lips but did not drink. I watched them. Vanessa was staring at me with an intensity that was almost predatory. She was waiting. Drink up, Dad, Brian urged. It is good stuff, I will, I said, but first I want to savor the aroma. I swirled the wine. I saw Brian take a large gulp. He drained half the glass in one go. Vanessa let out a breath she had been holding. She thought the deed was done. She thought I had drunk mine. She hadn't noticed the switch. That was when my phone rang. It was Henderson. The call that confirmed everything. When I answered and Henderson told me about the flashlights in my living room, the puzzle pieces slammed together. They weren't just poisoning me. They were robbing me at the same time. They knew I would be here. They knew the house was empty. They probably hired someone to break in, or maybe Brian gave them a key. I told Henderson I was at Brian's. And then Brian laughed. That laugh. It was the sound of a man who had lost his soul. It must be the rats, Dad, he said, his voice slurring slightly. Who cares about that old place? You won't need it much longer anyway. I put the phone down on the table. The screen was still lit. I hadn't hung up. Henderson was listening. What do you mean I won't need it, Brian? I asked softly. Brian blinked. He shook his head as if trying to clear a sudden fog. His face, which had been flushed, was turning a pale, sickly gray. I mean, you are old, he mumbled. His speech was thick like his tongue had swollen. You are tired. Brian, Vanessa asked, her voice sharp. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at my glass. It was still full. She looked at Brian's glass. It was half empty. The realization hit her like a physical blow. I saw the blood drain from her face. Her eyes darted from my glass to Brian's and then to me. She saw the cold, hard knowledge in my eyes. You, she whispered. Brian dropped his fork again. But this time he didn't bend down to pick it up. His hands clawed at his throat. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a wet, gurgling sound came out. Brian, Vanessa screamed, leaping from her chair. He fell forward, his chest hitting the table with a heavy thud, knocking over the wine bottle. The red liquid spilled across the white tablecloth like a river of blood. He was convulsing, his eyes rolling back into his head, foam gathering at the corners of his mouth. This wasn't aspirin. This wasn't a sleeping pill. This was an overdose of something powerful. Muscle relaxants. I had seen it before in insurance fraud cases involving livestock. It shuts down the respiratory system. Call 911. Vanessa shrieked at me, grabbing Brian's shoulders, trying to shake him awake. What did you do? What did you do to him? I did nothing. Vanessa, I said, standing up slowly. I simply didn't drink. He drank. You switched them, she hissed, her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred and terror. You old bastard. You switched them. She wasn't worried about saving him yet. She was worried about the narrative. She was accusing me. My phone was still on the table. Henderson was still on the line. Henderson, I said loud and clear. Call the police and an ambulance to my son's house. There has been a poisoning. And tell the officers at my house to detain whoever is in there. Vanessa froze. She looked at the phone. She realized she was trapped. She stopped shaking Brian and looked at me. For a second, I thought she might attack me. She grabbed a steak knife from the table. Give me the phone, Douglas, she commanded, her voice trembling. Hang up. We can fix this. We can say he had a seizure. We can... He is dying, Vanessa. I roared, slamming my hand on the table. My son is dying on the floor, and you are worried about the cover story. Brian's convulsions were slowing down. His breathing was shallow, ragged gasps. He was suffocating. Vanessa dropped the knife. She fell to her knees beside him, checking his pulse. But she wasn't checking to save him. She was checking to see if he was gone. I saw her hand slip into his pocket. She pulled out his phone. She was deleting things. I walked over and grabbed her wrist. I twisted it until she dropped the phone. "Don't touch anything," I said. "You don't understand." She sobbed, tears finally streaming down her face, though I suspect they were tears for herself. "He owes money. They are going to kill him if he doesn't pay. We needed the insurance. We needed the house. You were supposed to just go to sleep, just go to sleep." A euphemism for murder. The sirens were audible in the distance now. Seattle PD and EMS. Vanessa looked at Brian, then at me. "I will tell them you did it," she whispered, her eyes manic. "I will tell them you brought the wine. I will tell them you are senile and confused. It is your word against mine. I am a pharmacist. I know how to make it look like an accident. You are just a retired old man." I looked down at my son, who was turning blue. I felt a profound, crushing sadness. Not for the man he was today, but for the boy he used to be. The boy I taught to ride a bike. The boy I held when he scraped his knees. That boy was dead long before tonight. "You are forgetting one thing, Vanessa," I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out a handkerchief. I dabbed the spilled wine from the table, soaking the red liquid into the white fabric. I carefully folded it and put it in a plastic sandwich bag I had brought with me. I always come prepared. I have the sample I said, and I have the witness on the phone, and I have the motive considering your husband's friends are currently robbing my empty house. The front door burst open. Paramedics rushed in, followed by 2 police officers. "Save him!" Vanessa screamed instantly, switching into the role of the grieving wife. "My father-in-law. I think he gave him something." I stepped back, raising my hands calmly. "Check his blood," I said to the lead paramedic. "Check for muscle relaxants. And check the lady's apron pocket for the residue." As they worked on Brian, loading him onto the stretcher, I saw the fear in his eyes. He was conscious, locked inside his paralyzed body. He looked at me. He was pleading. I leaned in close as they wheeled him past. "The rats didn't get the safe, Brian," I whispered, "because the safe was empty." Vanessa was being questioned by an officer in the kitchen. She was pointing at me, crying hysterically. But I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at the officer's radio. "Dispatch to Unit 4. The radio crackled. "We have suspects in custody at the Douglas residence. 3 males. They claim they were hired by the homeowner's son." The officer looked at Vanessa. Vanessa stopped crying. "I suggest you get a lawyer, Vanessa," I said, buttoning my cardigan. "And make sure he is expensive, because I am about to spend every penny of my inheritance to make sure you both rot." I walked out into the rain. The air was cold, but for the first time in years, it felt clean. I took a deep breath. My son was in a coma. My daughter-in-law was a murderer. My house was a crime scene. But I was alive. And the game had just begun. In the next part, I will tell you what we found in Brian's phone and how I used a fake funeral to flush out the rest of the rats. You won't believe who shows up to pay their respects. Let me know in the comments what you would have done if you saw that powder. Would you have switched the glasses? Or would you have walked away? Subscribe for part 2, because revenge is a dish best served with a side of justice. The siren wail was a constant rhythmic drill against my skull, drowning out the sound of the rain battering the metal roof of the ambulance. I sat in the corner, a silent observer in the theater of my son's destruction. Brian was strapped to the gurney, a plastic mask over his face, his chest rising and falling in jerky, unnatural spasms. He looked like a broken marionette, strings cut, collapsing into himself. Vanessa sat on the other side, holding his limp hand. To the paramedic, a young man with sweat beading on his forehead, she looked like a devastated wife. She was crying, Her makeup smudged, her voice trembling with what appeared to be panic. But I knew better. I spent 40 years sitting across desks from people who had just burned down their own warehouses or crashed their cars into trees for a payout. I knew the difference between grief and damage control. Vanessa wasn't grieving. She was managing the narrative. "Does he have any history of heart problems?" the paramedic shouted over the siren. "Is he on any medication?" "Yes," Vanessa sobbed, nodding vigorously. "He has a history of seizures. His grandfather had epilepsy. He has been under so much stress lately. I think he took his anxiety medication with alcohol. He must have had a reaction." I watched her weave the web. It was impressive in a sickening way. She was planting the seeds of a plausible deniability. Anxiety medication plus alcohol equaled an accidental overdose. A history of seizures equaled a natural cause. She was trying to steer them away from a toxicology screen that would look for specific toxins. She wanted them to treat the symptoms, not the cause. I said nothing. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, feeling the plastic bag in my pocket crinkle slightly. The handkerchief inside was damp with the vintage Cabernet that was supposed to kill me. I looked at the monitor. Brian's heart rate was erratic, dropping dangerously low, and then spiking. His pupils were pinpoints. These weren't the tremors of an epileptic seizure. I had seen epilepsy. This was total neuromuscular blockade. His body was fighting a war it couldn't win because his own nervous system had been shut down. It reminded me of a case I handled in '98. A rancher in Montana had insured his prize stallions for millions. One by one, they dropped dead in their stalls. The vet said it was colic, but I noticed the way their muscles had locked up before death. We exhumed the horses and found high doses of a synthetic paralytic agent. The rancher had injected them to collect the insurance money. Vanessa was doing the same thing to her husband. She was treating him like livestock. When the ambulance screeched to a halt at the emergency bay, the back doors flew open. Cold, wet air rushed in, mixing with the smell of antiseptic and fear. A team of doctors met us on the tarmac. "What do we have?" the lead doctor asked, running alongside the gurney. "Male 32 possible seizure overdose on anxiety meds and alcohol," the paramedic reported, parroting Vanessa's lies. "No," Vanessa interjected, grabbing the doctor's sleeve as they entered the trauma hallway. "He has a heart condition. Please, you have to save him. Do not let him die." She was throwing everything at the wall, hoping something would stick, hoping to confuse them enough that they wouldn't look for the white powder she had ground up in her kitchen. I walked behind them, the ghost in the machine. I watched them cut off Brian's shirt. I saw the dark bruising already forming on his chest where he had hit the table. "Sir, a nurse blocked my path. You have to wait in the lobby." I looked at her. I looked at Brian, who was disappearing behind a curtain. And then I looked at Vanessa, who was watching me with the eyes of a cornered animal. "I will be right here," I said to the nurse. "I am not going anywhere." I walked to the waiting area and sat down. I didn't pick up a magazine. I didn't look at my phone. I closed my eyes and began to construct the timeline. I needed to be precise. The police would be here soon. Henderson had done his job. Now I had to do mine. Vanessa thought she was spinning a story of a tragic accident. She didn't realize she was narrating her own confession, and I was the stenographer. The hospital lobby was a purgatory of beige walls and flickering fluorescent lights. I sat near the vending machines, the low hum of the cooling fan providing a dull soundtrack to my thoughts. I needed air. I needed truth. I stood up and walked toward the automatic sliding doors, stepping out into the wet Seattle night. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, a mist that clung to my coat like a second skin. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My hand was steady. It is amazing how calm you become when you realize you have nothing left to lose. I dialed Henderson. He picked up on the first ring. "Douglas, are you okay?" he asked, his gruff voice thick with worry. I am fine, Henderson, I said, watching the steam rise from my breath. Tell me about my house. Tell me exactly what you saw. The police are there now, he reported. They caught one of them, trying to climb the back fence. The other two got away in a truck. But Douglas, I got the plate number and I got a good look at the vehicle before they took off. What kind of truck, I asked, though. A sick feeling in my gut told me I already knew the answer. It was a white pickup, heavy duty. It had a logo on the door. Faded blue letters. Miller Construction. Isn't that where Brian works? The world tilted slightly on its axis. Miller Construction. I had co-signed the loan for Brian to buy his tools when he started there. I had sat at my kitchen table and helped him fill out the employment paperwork, proud that he was finally trying to settle an honest life. Yes, Henderson, I whispered. That is where he works. I closed my eyes. The betrayal wasn't just deep. It was total. It was comprehensive. The dinner invitation wasn't an olive branch. It was a timestamp. It was an alibi. Come over, Dad. Let's eat. Let's drink. And while you are choking on your own fluids, my crew will be stripping your house to the studs. They didn't just want me dead. They wanted to erase me. They wanted the safe in the wall, the one Brian had seen me open once 5 years ago when I took out my passport. He thought my life savings were in there. He thought he was cracking the vault. Did they get the safe, I asked. Yeah, Henderson sighed. They dragged it out the back door. Took a chunk of the drywall with it. It looked heavy. I let out a short, dry laugh that turned into a cough. It wasn't heavy, Henderson. It was full of old newspapers and a few bricks I put in there to give it weight. I stopped keeping money in the house the day Brian asked me which wall was load-bearing. Douglas, what is going on? Henderson asked. Why was your son laughing when I told you about the robbery? Because he thought he had won, I said. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. Thank you, Henderson. Tell the police I will be there within the hour. I have some business to finish here first. I hung up the phone. I looked back through the glass doors of the emergency room. Vanessa was pacing in the hallway, talking on her cell phone, gesturing wildly. She wasn't calling her family. She wasn't calling a priest. She was calling the crew. She was telling them the plan had gone sideways. I put my phone back in my pocket. My son hired a construction crew to rob his father while his wife poisoned the wine. It was a family business after all, and I was about to conduct a hostile takeover. I walked back into the sterile brightness of the hospital corridor, the smell of bleach and floor wax assaulting my senses. Vanessa was waiting. She had ended her call with the construction crew, and the moment she spotted me coming through the sliding doors, she underwent a transformation that was terrifying to behold. The manic pacing woman I had seen through the glass vanished. In her place stood a shattered, weeping wife. Her shoulders hunched, her hands trembling as she clutched a manila envelope to her chest like a shield. Douglas, she cried out, running toward me. Her heels clicked sharply on the linoleum, a staccato rhythm of panic. Douglas, the doctors. They say he needs a specialist, a neurotoxin expert. They want to transfer him to a private facility, but our insurance, it lapsed last month. They won't move him without a deposit. She grabbed my lapels, her eyes wide and wet. She was good. If I hadn't just watched her coordinate a felony on her cell phone, I might have believed her. How much, Vanessa? I asked, keeping my voice steady. I needed to see how far she would go. 50,000, she sobbed. They need it now tonight, or they say the damage will be permanent. He could be brain dead by morning. Please, Douglas, you have to help us. I looked down at her. $50,000. That was the exact amount of gambling debt I had paid off for Brian 2 years ago. It seemed to be their magic number. I don't have that kind of cash on me, Vanessa, I said. You know that. I know, she stammered, stepping back and fumbling with the clasp of the envelope she was holding. But Brian, he was worried about finances. He had some papers drawn up last week. Just in case. He wanted to get a reverse mortgage on your house to help with bills, but he never asked you because he was too proud. She pulled out a stack of documents, the pages slightly bent at the corners. She smoothed them out against the wall, her hands shaking so hard the paper rattled. If you sign this, she said, thrusting a pen at me, we can use the house as collateral. The hospital billing department said they would accept a lien on the property as a guarantee. Just sign here and they will call the specialist. Please, Dad, save your son. I took the papers from her. The top page was thick, high-quality bond paper. I put on my reading glasses, the ones I used to scrutinize insurance claims for structural damage. Vanessa was watching me, her breath held her eyes darting from my face to the pen in my hand. I skipped the cover letter. Cover letters are fluff. I went straight to the second page, the operative document. I scanned the legal jargon. I had read thousands of these in my career. It took me less than 10 seconds to realize what I was looking at. This wasn't a loan application. This wasn't a reverse mortgage. This wasn't a lien for a hospital. It was a quitclaim deed. It was a document transferring full ownership of my property, the house I had bought with my late wife 30 years ago, to Brian and Vanessa Miller. The consideration listed was $10. There was no mention of a hospital. There was no mention of a specialist. This was a permanent, irrevocable transfer of title. I looked at the date stamp on the notary section. It was dated today. They had this ready. They had brought this to dinner. The plan wasn't just to kill me. The plan was to drug me, get a signature while I was incapacitated, or perhaps forge it once I was dead and backdate it. Now, in her desperation, she was trying to force me to sign away my life's work to save the husband she had just poisoned. I looked up at her. The mask was slipping. Beneath the tears, I saw the greed. It was hungry and desperate. This isn't a loan document, Vanessa, I said, my voice cold enough to freeze the air between us. This is a title transfer. You aren't asking for help. You are asking for my house. She froze. Her eyes narrowed. Does it matter what it is? She hissed, dropping the grieving wife act for a split second. He is your son. He is dying in there. Are you going to let him die over a pile of wood and bricks? Sign the damn paper, Douglas. She shoved the pen at my chest again, hard enough to leave a mark. I looked at the paper. I looked at the door where Brian lay unconscious. And then I looked at Vanessa. I am not signing this, I said. And Brian isn't dying because of money. He is dying because you don't know the difference between a sedative and a paralytic. I folded the papers and put them in my inside pocket right next to the wine-soaked handkerchief. I will keep these for safekeeping, I said. The police will want to see what you brought to a family dinner. Vanessa lunged for me, her nails aiming for my face, a feral scream rising in her throat. But before she could touch me, the doors behind us opened. A doctor stepped out, looking grim. Family of Brian Miller, he called out. Vanessa stopped dead. She looked at the doctor, then at me. She smoothed her hair, took a deep breath, and turned around, the mask of the grieving wife sliding back into place instantly. But I had seen what was underneath, and I had the paperwork to prove it. The doctor looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from fighting a losing battle. He adjusted his glasses and looked at us, his expression professional but grim. Mr. Miller has slipped into a deep coma, he said, his voice low. His respiratory function is severely compromised. We have him on a ventilator, but the next 24 hours are critical. The toxin, whatever it is, has attacked his central nervous system. We are doing everything we can, but you should prepare yourselves. Vanessa let out a strangled cry, burying her face in her hands. It was a perfect performance, timed to the second. Oh God, Brian, she wailed, her shoulders shaking. But as the doctor turned to check a chart on the wall, Vanessa's head snapped up. She didn't look at the doctor. She looked at me. Her eyes were dry. They were hard, flat stones devoid of any humanity. She stepped closer, invading my personal space, the smell of her expensive perfume mixing with the hospital's antiseptic stench in a nauseating blend. "He is in a coma because of you," she whispered, her voice a low hiss that the doctor couldn't hear. "You and your stubbornness. If you had just drunk the wine, we would be mourning a tragedy right now, and Brian would be rich. Instead, he is a vegetable, and you are still standing here breathing air you don't deserve." She held out her hand, palm open, expecting compliance. "Give me the deed, Douglas. Sign it. Now. Before the police start asking questions. If I have the house, I can pay off the people who are coming for us. If I don't, they will come for you next." I looked at her hand. It was steady. No trembling. No grief. Just pure, unadulterated entitlement. She truly believed she deserved my life's work simply because she had failed to kill me for it. "No," I said. It was a simple word, but it landed between us like a gavel strike. "You think you can win," she sneered, her lip curling back to reveal teeth that looked too sharp. "You are an old man with no friends. I am the grieving wife. Who will they believe? The loving daughter-in-law or the father who hated his son? They will believe the toxicology report," I said, quietly meeting her gaze. "And they will believe the handwriting expert who analyzes the forgery on that deed." Vanessa's face contorted. For a moment, the beautiful grieving widow vanished entirely. In her place was something ugly and raw. She looked at me with such pure, concentrated loathing that I instinctively took a step back. It wasn't anger. It was the look of a predator that realizes its prey has teeth. "I hope you live a long time, Douglas," she spat. "I hope you live long enough to rot alone in that big, empty house." The doctor turned back around. "Mrs. Miller, would you like to see him?" Vanessa blinked, and the mask slammed back down. "Yes." She choked out a sob catching in her throat. "Please let me see my husband." She brushed past me, bumping my shoulder hard. I watched her walk into the trauma room and take the hand of the man she had destroyed. Brian lay motionless, a tube down his throat, a machine breathing for him. He looked small. He looked like the little boy who used to ask me to check under his bed for monsters. He never realized the monster was sleeping right next to him. I left the hospital not as a grieving father, but as a man on a mission. The rain had turned into a relentless downpour, washing the grime off the Seattle streets, but doing nothing to cleanse the filth I had just witnessed. I drove straight to the financial district where the skyscrapers pierced the low-hanging clouds like needles. I wasn't going home. Home was a crime scene. I was going to the only place where truth was a commodity that could be bought and sold. The law offices of Reynolds and Associates. Reynolds was waiting for me. He was a man I had known for 30 years, a legal shark who swam in the same murky waters of high-stakes finance that I did. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He poured 2 fingers of scotch and pointed to the leather chair opposite his desk. Sitting in the shadows was Frank, a private investigator I had worked with on a dozen insurance fraud cases back in the 90s. Frank looked like a rumpled bedsheet, but he had a mind like a steel trap. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I reached into my inside pocket and pulled out the sandwich bag. The white handkerchief inside was stained a deep, violent crimson. It looked innocent enough, like a napkin from a messy dinner, but we all knew it was the smoking gun. "It is a muscle relaxant," I said, sliding the bag across the mahogany desk. Based on the onset of symptoms and the foaming at the mouth, I would guess succinylcholine or something similar. She crushed it into a powder and mixed it with ice to mask the residue. Frank picked up the bag, holding it up to the light. He didn't flinch. "I have a contact at the toxicology lab who owes me a favor," Frank rumbled, his voice like gravel. "I can get a preliminary analysis by morning. If this matches what is in your son's blood, we have her on attempted murder." Reynolds leaned forward, steepling his fingers. His eyes were cold and calculating. He wasn't thinking about the science. He was thinking about the chessboard. "We need to look at the contingencies," Douglas Reynolds said. "The son is in a coma. That complicates things. As it stands, Vanessa is his next of kin. She holds his medical power of attorney by default, unless he designated otherwise. She controls his care. She controls who visits him. And most importantly, if he dies, she controls his estate. And if he survives but has brain damage," I asked, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Then she becomes his legal guardian." Reynolds replied without hesitation. "She will have access to everything he owns, and she will use his condition to play the victim card in front of a jury. She will say the stress of his condition caused her to make bad financial decisions. She will milk his tragedy for every cent." I felt a cold fury rising in my chest. I was not going to let that woman use my son as a human shield. "We need to sever her control," I said. "We can file for an emergency injunction," Reynolds countered. "We argue that she is a person of interest in his poisoning. If the police charge her, her rights over him are suspended. But we need that toxicology report fast. We need to prove she handed him the glass." "That is why I need you to dig," I said, turning to Frank. "I need to know everything about her. I need to know where she buys her coffee. I need to know who she talks to when she thinks no one is listening. And I need to know about the debt. She mentioned Brian owed money. Find out who holds the paper." Frank nodded, tucking the evidence bag into his jacket. "Consider it done." Reynolds looked at me, his expression softening just a fraction. "Douglas, you realize what happens if we go down this road. If Brian wakes up, he might hate you for sending his wife to prison. If he doesn't wake up, you are going to be fighting a war over a grave." I stood up, buttoning my coat. I looked at the two men who were now my generals in this war. "He tried to rob me, Reynolds. He laughed while his friends tore apart my home. The son I knew died a long time ago. I am just trying to make sure the woman who killed him doesn't get paid for the job." I walked out of the office, leaving the scotch untouched. The time for drinking was over. The hunt had begun. Frank opened a black leather folder and slid a series of glossy photographs across the polished mahogany desk. They weren't pictures of infidelity. They were pictures of violence. A smashed windshield, a dead dog on a porch, a screenshot of a text message that read simply, "TikTok. Your son didn't just make bad investments, Douglas." Frank said, his voice dropping to a rumble that vibrated in the quiet office. "He didn't buy bad stocks. He gambled. He gambled big, and he gambled stupid. He is into the Russian syndicate for $500,000. I stared at the number written on the notepad. $500,000. It was a lifetime of savings for some. It was a death sentence for others. It explains the desperation, Reynolds added, looking at the file. You don't try to kill your father over a credit card bill. You kill him because the wolves are at the door. Frank tapped one of the photos. It showed Vanessa arguing with a man in a leather jacket outside her pharmacy. She looked small, terrified. The man looked like a slab of granite. That was taken 3 days ago, Frank continued. My source says they gave her an ultimatum. Pay the interest by the end of the week, or they start taking pieces of Brian, specifically his fingers. They told her they would chop them off one by one until the debt was cleared. I felt a wave of nausea, not out of sympathy for the danger they were in, but out of disgust at the solution they had chosen. They didn't come to me. They didn't ask for help. They didn't try to go to the police. They decided the easiest way to solve their problem was to liquidate me. I was just an asset to be converted. My life was the check they intended to write to keep Brian's hands intact. So that is the timeline, I said, my voice sounding hollow in my own ears. The dinner, the rush, the pressure to sign the deed at the hospital. It all aligns with the collection schedule of a loan shark. Exactly, Reynolds said. And they were counting on 2 things. First, your life insurance. We checked. Brian took out a policy on you 2 years ago, forging your signature. It pays out double for accidental death. Poisoning could be framed as an accidental overdose if the coroner is lazy. Second, the house. With you dead or incapacitated and that quitclaim deed signed, they could flip the property to a hard money lender within 48 hours. They weren't just robbing me, I realized. They were stripping me for parts. I was a junk car to them. And Vanessa, I asked, is she just a victim of Brian's mess, or is she driving the car? Frank snorted. She is the navigator, Douglas. Brian is too weak to pull the trigger. He panics. You saw him tonight. He was laughing because he was high on adrenaline and fear. But Vanessa, she is the one who researched the toxins. She is the one who ground the pills. She figured out that killing you was cleaner than divorcing him and inheriting his debt. If Brian dies, the debt dies with him usually. But if she saves him using your money, she keeps the husband and gets the house. She calculated the odds and decided you were the variable she could afford to lose. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city lights reflected in the wet pavement. They traded my life for a gambling debt, I whispered. They traded your life for convenience, Reynolds corrected. And now that Brian is in a coma, the sharks are going to be looking for a new person to squeeze. Vanessa is going to be desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. I turned back to them. Let them come, I said. If Vanessa wants to play with monsters, she is about to find out that her father-in-law is the scariest thing in the dark. Frank, I want you to find out who holds the note. I want a name. You want to pay it? Frank asked, raising an eyebrow. No, I said, buttoning my coat. I want to introduce myself. I want them to know that the bank is closed, and I want Vanessa to know that she is alone. The yellow police tape fluttering across my front porch was the only decoration my house had seen in years. It snapped in the wind, a wet plastic sound that cut through the silence of the neighborhood. I stepped under it, pushing open the front door that hung loosely on one hinge. The lock had been drilled out. It was amateur work, sloppy and loud, just like my son. Inside the house was a graveyard of memories. They had torn through the living room with the subtlety of a hurricane. Books were pulled from shelves, their spines broken pages scattering across the hardwood like dead leaves. My leather armchair, the one I had sat in for 20 years, while reading risk analysis reports, was overturned and slashed open, stuffing spilling out like guts. They thought I hid money in the cushions. They watched too many movies. I walked to the master bedroom. The drywall dust hung in the air, coating my throat. And there it was. The gaping hole in the wall behind the painting of the seascape. The painting lay face down on the floor, a footprint stamped right in the middle of the canvas. The wall safe was gone. They had taken a sledgehammer to the studs and ripped the whole unit out. I stared at the jagged edges of the hole and felt a dry, dark amusement bubble up in my chest. It must have taken 3 men to carry it. It weighed over 200 pounds. They probably high-fived each other as they loaded it into the truck, thinking they had secured their retirement. I hoped they enjoyed the contents. Inside that safe, they would find a stack of expired coupons, 7 years of tax returns that I had already digitized, and 4 heavy paving bricks I had wrapped in towels to stop them from rattling. It was a decoy I installed 10 years ago, the day Brian asked me for a loan, and his eyes lingered too long on the wall. I stepped over the debris and walked to the kitchen. This room was relatively untouched. They didn't think to look here. They were looking for the obvious symbols of wealth. I opened the pantry door. The smell of dry rice and onions greeted me. I knelt down and pushed aside a heavy crate of canned goods. Beneath it was a section of linoleum that looked identical to the rest of the floor. I pressed my thumb against a specific tile in the corner. A soft click echoed, barely audible. The section popped up. I lifted the trapdoor. A rush of cool, dry air hit my face. I climbed down the narrow ladder into the crawl space I had reinforced with concrete back in '85. I clicked on the single battery-operated lantern hanging from a hook. It was all there. The waterproof cases stacked neatly against the wall. The bearer bonds. The gold Krugerrands. The hard drives containing the digital keys to my offshore accounts. And the files. The files on every crooked contractor, every corrupt city official, and every loan shark in Seattle. This was my real life. This was the leverage that kept me safe. I ran my hand over the cool metal of the cases. My son had destroyed my home for a box of bricks while he stood on top of a fortune he would never touch. I climbed back up, sealed the floor, and moved the potato crate back into place. I didn't feel violated. I felt validated. They had taken the bait. Now I was going to close the trap. My phone buzzed against my hip, a violent vibration in the dead silence of the house. I pulled it out. The screen illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. It was a text message from a number I didn't recognize. A burner. I swiped the screen. A picture loaded slowly. It was a photo of Brian in his hospital bed taken from the doorway. He looked small and gray against the white sheets the ventilator tube taped to his mouth like a gag. Beneath the image was a message written in block text. "We know the safe was empty, old man. You think you are clever with your bricks, but bricks do not pay debts. You have 24 hours to find the real money. 500,000, or we pull the plug on your son." I stared at the pixels. The threat was blunt, brutal, and clumsy. It was designed to trigger a father's panic response. It was designed to make me run to the bank and empty accounts they hoped existed. But I didn't panic. I analyzed. A professional collector doesn't send texts threatening to kill the golden goose's offspring unless they have no other leverage. They break kneecaps. They burn businesses. They don't threaten to turn off a ventilator in a hospital full of witnesses. This message wasn't from the Russian syndicate. This message was personal. I read the line again. "You think you are clever." That wasn't the voice of a gangster. That was the voice of a woman who had been humiliated in a hospital hallway. That was Vanessa. She was trying to use the very monsters she feared to terrorize me. She was proxying her own desperation through a burner app, hoping I would be too terrified to tell the difference between a cartel hitman and a greedy pharmacist. She wanted me to believe that the sharks were watching me right now. She wanted me to believe that Brian's life depended on my wallet. But she made a critical error. She assumed I valued Brian's life more than she did. She assumed I would pay to save a man who laughed while his friends robbed me. I didn't reply. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I took a screenshot of the message and forwarded it to Frank. "Trace it," I typed, "and tell Reynolds to add extortion to the list." I put the phone away and looked around my destroyed living room one last time. Vanessa wanted a war. She wanted to play the victim and the villain at the same time. She thought she could scare me into submission. But as I stepped out onto the porch and locked the broken door behind me, I felt a strange sense of calm. She had just given me the invitation I needed. She wanted the money. I was going to show her exactly where it was, and I was going to make sure she dug her own grave trying to get to it. I walked into the hospital cafeteria with the posture of a man who had been broken. I let my shoulders slump forward, my head hang low, and I practiced a slight tremor in my right hand. It is a trick I learned from a fraudster back in '92 who tried to fake Parkinson's to get out of a deposition. People see the shake and they stop looking at the eyes, and the eyes are where the truth lives. Vanessa was sitting at a corner table nursing a cold cup of coffee. She looked exhausted, her makeup cracking around the edges, but her eyes were darting around the room like a radar sweeping for threats. When she saw me approaching, she straightened up, her face hardening into a mask of hostility. "What do you want, Douglas?" she snapped. "Unless you are here to sign the house over, get away from me." I didn't say a word. I just pulled out my phone and opened the picture of the text message. I laid it on the table in front of her as my hand shaking violently enough to rattle the silverware. "They sent this," I whispered, my voice cracking. They said they are going to pull the plug. They said 24 hours. Vanessa looked at the phone. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look horrified. She looked impatient. She put a hand over her mouth, feigning a gasp, but her eyes remained cold. "Oh my God," she said, her voice flat. "I told you, Douglas. I told you they were dangerous. You have to pay them. You have to give them what they want." "I don't have 500,000 in the bank, Vanessa," I stammered, pulling out a chair and collapsing into it. "The robbery. They took the safe. I told the police it was empty, but I let the sentence trail off. I looked down at the table, avoiding her gaze, but what she asked, leaning forward. The shark smelled blood in the water, but I didn't keep everything in the safe, I lied. I lowered my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. I never trusted banks, Vanessa. Not after the crash in 2008. I liquidated my portfolio. I converted it to what she hissed, grabbing my wrist. Her grip was strong, desperate. "Cash," I said, "and bonds, $2 million. Her eyes widened. I saw the pupils dilate. The exhaustion vanished from her face, replaced by a hunger so raw it was almost obscenity. $2 million. It was enough to pay the debt, buy a new house, and disappear. It was the jackpot she had been trying to kill me for. "Where is it, Douglas?" she demanded, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Is it in the house? Is it under the floorboards?" "No," I said, shaking my head. "It is safer than that. It is at the old property, the farmhouse in Aberdeen, under the big oak tree by the creek. I buried it in a steel case 6 years ago. Only I know the coordinates. Aberdeen." It was a 2-hour drive into the middle of nowhere, a desolate stretch of land I hadn't visited in a decade. "We have to go," she said, immediately standing up. "We have to get it now." "I can't drive," I whined, rubbing my temples. "I am too shaken up. My vision is blurry. I need to rest." "No," she said, pulling me up by the arm. "There is no time to rest. If we don't pay them by tomorrow, Brian is dead. I will drive. You just show me where to dig." I looked at her. She had taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. She was so blinded by the promise of $2 million that she didn't stop to ask why a man who just survived a poisoning attempt would trust his daughter-in-law with a shovel in the middle of the woods. "Okay," I said weakly. "Take me there." As we walked out of the hospital, I saw her hand check her pocket. She was making sure she had her phone. She was probably texting the loan sharks to tell them the payment was coming. She didn't know she was driving straight into a nightmare of her own making. I let her lead me to the car, stumbling a little for effect. She opened the door for me, not out of kindness, but because she didn't want to lose the map to the treasure. The rain lashed against the windshield of Vanessa's leased Range Rover, blurring the world outside into streaks of gray and green. We were on I-5 South, heading toward the deep woods of Aberdeen. Vanessa was driving like she was running from the devil, weaving through traffic, her knuckles white on the leather steering wheel. Every muscle in her body was coiled tight, vibrating with a mixture of greed and adrenaline. I sat in the passenger seat, slumped against the door, watching her. It was time to turn the screws. "Brenda, you are going too fast," I whined, clutching the dashboard with feigned terror. "Slow down. The gold isn't going anywhere." "My name is Vanessa Douglas," she snapped, her eyes fixed on the road. "Brenda was your wife. She's been dead for 10 years. "Oh, right," I mumbled, shaking my head. "Vanessa, Brian's wife. The one with the expensive taste. You know, Brenda never liked driving in the rain. She said it was bad for the tires." Vanessa didn't reply. She just pressed harder on the gas. I waited 5 minutes. Then I started humming. Low at first, a tuneless, grating drone. Then I added words. I chose an old nursery rhyme, "Row, row, row your boat," but I sang it slow and off-key, dragging out the vowels until they sounded like a dying cat. Row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Douglas, please, Vanessa hissed through gritted teeth. I need to concentrate. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream, I sang louder, tapping my fingers on the dashboard in an erratic rhythm. She slammed her hand against the steering wheel. Stop it. Stop singing. I jumped, acting startled. I looked at her with wide, innocent eyes. You don't have to yell, Brenda, I said, my voice trembling. I was just trying to keep our spirits up. It is a long drive. It is Vanessa, she screamed, her composure finally cracking. My name is Vanessa. Okay, Vanessa, I said soothingly. You seem stressed. Maybe we should stop. We are not stopping, she growled. We are an hour away. I squirmed in my seat. I groaned, clutching my stomach. I need to use the restroom, I said. You just went at the hospital, she argued. That was coffee, I said. Now it is water. I have a weak bladder, Vanessa. You know how it is when you get old. If I don't go now, I am going to ruin your nice leather seats. She looked at me with pure murder in her eyes. She calculated the cost of detailing the car versus the cost of stopping. The car won. Fine, she spat, swerving onto the muddy shoulder of a deserted exit ramp. Hurry up. I opened the door and stepped out into the drizzle. I moved with agonizing slowness. I stretched my back. I looked at the trees. I took a few steps toward the bushes, then stopped to tie my shoe. What are you doing? Vanessa screamed from the open window. Go. I am looking for a dry spot. I called back. I don't want to slip. I took 5 minutes. 5 minutes of standing behind a bush, staring at the wet leaves, listening to Vanessa screaming into her phone inside the car. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her hitting the dashboard. She was unraveling. She was exhausted, terrified of the loan sharks, and now she was being tortured by a senile old man who couldn't remember her name. When I finally got back in the car, I made sure to track a significant amount of mud onto the floor mat. Did you wash your hands? She asked, wrinkling her nose. It is nature, Vanessa, I said cheerfully, buckling my seatbelt with clumsy, fumbling fingers. It is clean dirt. She peeled out onto the highway, the tires spinning in the gravel. Are we close? She asked, her voice tight. I squinted at the road signs. I think so, I said. Or maybe it was the next exit. No, wait. I think we passed it. Vanessa slammed on the brakes, sending us skidding slightly. You passed it, she shrieked. I don't know, I said, rubbing my forehead. It all looks the same in the rain. Maybe if you turn around, I will recognize the barn. She screamed a raw, guttural sound of frustration and whipped the car into a U-turn across the median strip. It was illegal. It was dangerous. It was perfect. She was no longer thinking. She was just reacting. She was a rat in a maze, and I was holding the cheese. We drove back and forth for another 20 minutes, while I pretended to look for a red barn that I knew had been torn down 5 years ago. Finally, I pointed to a narrow, overgrown dirt road leading into the dense forest. There, I said. That is the path. The money is down there. Vanessa turned the wheel, plunging the luxury SUV into the mud and darkness. She didn't care about the scratching branches or the deep potholes. She only cared about the $2 million. She didn't know she was driving her getaway car into a trap. I leaned back and started humming again. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. The car skidded to a halt in a clearing that looked like a wound in the forest floor. The mud was thick, a churning sea of brown sludge that swallowed the tires of the Range Rover halfway up the rubber. The rain here wasn't just falling. It was driving down in sheets, cold and unforgiving, turning the world into a blurred watercolor of gray and black. Vanessa didn't wait for the engine to cool. She threw the door open and scrambled out, slipping immediately in the muck. She caught herself on the hood, leaving a streak of mud across the pristine white paint. She didn't care. She ran to the trunk and ripped it open, grabbing the shovel she had bought with my stolen money. It was a shiny, orange-handled thing that looked like it had never touched dirt. That was about to change. I took my time. I buttoned my raincoat all the way to the chin. I checked my pockets to make sure my phone was dry. Then I stepped out and opened my large black umbrella. It opened with a satisfying snap, a shield against the chaos. I stepped carefully onto a patch of grass, keeping my shoes relatively clean. "Where is it?" Vanessa screamed, her voice fighting the roar of the wind. "Which tree?" I pointed a trembling finger toward a massive gnarled oak tree about 20 yards away. Its roots twisted out of the ground like arthritic fingers. "That one," I shouted over the rain. "The big one. Dig on the north side, between the two largest roots." Vanessa didn't hesitate. She marched through the sludge, her expensive designer boots sinking deep with every step. By the time she reached the tree, she was already soaked to the bone. Her hair, usually perfectly styled, was plastered to her skull in rat tails. Her makeup was running in dark streaks down her face, making her look like a weeping clown. She drove the shovel into the earth with a feral grunt. The ground was hard-packed with stones and roots. The shovel bounced off a rock, jarring her arms. She cursed and struck again. I walked over and stood under the shelter of the oak's canopy, keeping a respectful distance. I held my umbrella high, watching her work. It was a magnificent sight. The woman who thought she was too good to work, the woman who looked down on waitresses and cleaners, was now covered in filth, sweating and grunting, like a ditch digger. A little to the left. "Vanessa," I advised, adjusting my glasses. "I think I buried it deeper. You need to put your back into it." She stopped, leaning on the shovel chest, heaving. She wiped mud from her eyes, smearing it across her forehead. She looked at me with a mixture of exhaustion and pure hatred. "Why aren't you helping?" she gasped. "I am an old man, Vanessa," I said, my voice calm and dry. "My back is bad, and you are the one in a hurry. Remember the loan sharks. Tick-tock." The mention of the debt was like a whip crack. She groaned and started digging again. She dug with a manic energy, throwing heavy clods of wet earth over her shoulder. Dirt flew onto her clothes, her face, her hair. She tore a fingernail on a root and didn't even stop to look at the blood. She just kept digging. I stood there, dry and comfortable, watching the greed strip away her humanity layer by layer. She wasn't a person anymore. She was just a machine fueled by avarice. Every shovel load was a confession. Every grunt was a guilty plea. She dug for an hour, then 2. The hole was getting deep, a dark grave in the middle of the woods. She was up to her waist in it, slipping and sliding, her breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. "Are you sure it is here?" she screamed, her voice raw. "I think so," I said, checking my watch. "Unless it was the other oak tree. But keep going. I have a good feeling about this one." She let out a scream of pure frustration and slammed the shovel down. And then a sound cut through the rain. Clang, metal on metal. Vanessa froze. She looked down into the muddy water pooling at the bottom of the hole. Her eyes went wide. The exhaustion vanished, replaced instantly by a jolt of electric greed. She dropped to her knees in the mud, plunging her hands into the freezing slurry. She clawed at the earth like a wild animal, ignoring the sharp rocks tearing at her skin. "I found it," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "I found it." She pulled and tugged, grunting with effort. Slowly, a rusted metal corner emerged from the mud. Then another. It was an old ammunition box, corroded and heavy. I had buried it there 5 years ago when I was clearing out the shed, mostly just to get rid of some scrap metal and junk. Vanessa hauled it out of the hole, cradling it against her chest, like a newborn baby, not caring that the rust was staining her coat. She scrambled out of the pit, slipping, falling face first into the mud, and crawling back up. She dragged the box to the base of the tree where the ground was firmer. "Open it," she panted, her hands shaking so hard she couldn't work the latch. "Help me open it." I stepped closer, tilting my umbrella to keep the rain off the box. I didn't want her to miss a single detail. "Be careful," I whispered. "It is delicate." She found a rock and smashed the rusted padlock. Once, twice. It shattered. She threw the lock into the bushes and threw the lid open. She expected gold bars. She expected stacks of cash wrapped in plastic. She expected her salvation. Instead, she stared into the box. Inside, resting on a bed of wet, rotting leaves, was the skeleton of a large rat. Its small white skull seemed to be grinning up at her. And next to the bones was a single piece of laminated paper. It had survived the elements perfectly. Vanessa reached in her fingers, trembling, and picked up the paper. She held it up to the dim light. It read in bold black letters, "Greed is a trap." She stared at the note. She stared at the rat bones. Her brain couldn't process it. She looked at the empty box, then turned it upside down and shook it as if the $2 million were hiding under the dead rodent. Nothing fell out but dirty water. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." She looked up at me. She was covered in mud from head to toe. She was bleeding. She was shivering. And she was empty. "Where is it?" she screamed, lunging at me. "Where is the money?" I stepped back, keeping the umbrella between us. I looked at the box with an expression of genuine confusion. "That is strange," I said, scratching my head. "I could have sworn I put it there. Or maybe I moved it to the storage unit in Idaho. Or was it the safety deposit box in Portland? My memory isn't what it used to be, Vanessa. You know how it is. I get so confused lately." Vanessa let out a sound that wasn't human. It was a primal howl of despair and rage that echoed through the trees. She kicked the box, sending the rat bones scattering into the mud. She fell to her knees, sobbing into her hands, defeated by a dead rat and an old man's memory. I looked down at her, feeling nothing but a cold satisfaction. "We should probably head back," I said casually. "It is getting dark, and I think I left the stove on." The machines were the only things breathing in the private hospital room. The ventilator pushed air in and out of Brian with a rhythmic mechanical hiss that sounded like a metronome counting down the remaining seconds of his life. I sat in the high-backed chair in the corner, deeply shadowed, watching the rise and fall of his chest. The doctors had warned us that the toxin was a heavy-duty muscle relaxant, usually reserved for large livestock. It didn't just put you to sleep. It severed the connection between the brain and the body. They said he would wake up mentally before he could move physically. It was a condition known as locked-in syndrome, temporary, but terrifying. I saw the change happen at 3 a.m. The monitors didn't beep any faster, but the quality of the silence in the room shifted. Brian's eyelids fluttered rapidly, like the wings of a moth trapped in a jar. Then they snapped open. His eyes were wild. They darted left then right, scanning the ceiling, the tubes, the IV bags hanging like plastic fruit above him. I could see the panic rising in him, a tidal wave of terror crashing against the shores of his paralyzed mind. He tried to lift his head. Nothing happened. He tried to open his mouth to scream. His jaw remained slack, held open by the plastic bite block of the ventilator. He was a prisoner in his own skin, screaming into a void that no one else could hear. I leaned forward into the light. His eyes locked onto me. There was confusion at first, a desperate plea for help. Daddy was thinking. "Help me." But I didn't move. I just watched him. I watched as his gaze shifted to the other side of the bed, where Vanessa was sleeping in a recliner, exhausted from her muddy excursion in the woods. Brian stared at his wife, and then I saw the memory hit him. It wasn't a gradual realization. It was a violent impact. He remembered the dinner. He remembered the wine glass. He remembered the ice cubes melting in the dark red liquid. He remembered that Vanessa had handed him that glass, but I had switched them. The realization washed over his face, not in expressions because his face was frozen, but in the depth of his eyes. The confusion evaporated, replaced by a horror so profound it made the air in the room feel cold. He looked at the woman sleeping 3 feet away, and he knew. He knew she hadn't just made a mistake. He knew she had ground those pills. He knew she had prepared a lethal dose. And he knew that if I hadn't switched the glasses, he would be the one sitting in the chair watching his father die. He tried to thrash. The monitors spiked his heart rate, jumping from 60 to 120 in seconds. The alarm began to wail, a high-pitched warning that shattered the quiet. Vanessa jolted awake. She looked disheveled, her hair still damp from the rain, her eyes rimmed with red. She saw Brian awake and staring at her. She didn't rush to hug him. She didn't cry out in relief. She froze. She looked into her husband's eyes, and she saw that he knew. There is a specific look a man gives his wife when he realizes she tried to murder his father and accidentally killed him instead. It is a look of total, absolute betrayal. Brian's eyes were wide, unblinking, and filled with a terror that had nothing to do with the hospital. He was looking at his executioner. The nurse rushed in, silencing the alarm, checking the vitals. "He is awake," she said, checking his pupil response. "Brian, squeeze my hand if you can hear me." Brian didn't squeeze. He couldn't. But his eyes never left Vanessa. He was screaming at her with his gaze, accusing her, judging her, terrified of her. He realized that the person who was supposed to be his partner was actually his predator. And he realized something even worse. He was paralyzed, helpless, and alone in a room with the woman who wanted him dead. I stood up slowly. The air in the room was thick with unspoken accusations. It was time to give them some privacy. It was time to let the rats turn on each other. "I am going to get some coffee," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I will give you two a moment." I walked out of the room, leaving my son trapped in his silent hell, staring at the wife who had poisoned him. I didn't go far. Just down the hall to the waiting area where the vending machines hummed. I sat down and pulled a small wireless earbud from my pocket. I placed it in my ear and tapped the receiver on my phone. I had placed a small, high-powered listening device under the hospital bed frame while the nurse was checking the IV bag earlier. The audio feed crackled to life. I heard the door click shut. I heard the nurse leave. And then I heard the silence of the room, broken only by the hiss of the ventilator. Then came the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Vanessa was moving closer. I could hear her breathing fast and shallow. "Brian," she whispered. Her voice was low, a jagged hiss right next to the microphone. "Don't look at me like that, Brian. Stop it." There was a pause. I could imagine Brian's unblinking stare burning a hole through her. "You know why I did it?" she continued, her voice trembling, not with regret, but with a desperate, aggressive energy. "We had no choice. The loan sharks, Brian. They were going to cut your hands off. They sent me pictures of what they do. I did this for us. I did this to save you." I heard the rustle of sheets. She was probably leaning over him, getting right in his face, blocking his view of the rest of the room. "And don't you dare think about blaming me," she hissed, her tone shifting from pleading to threatening in a heartbeat. "You are in this just as deep as I am. Who hired the crew to break into his house, Brian? You did. Who gave them the key code? You did. Who drove the truck? Your foreman." I took a sip of the stale hospital coffee, listening to her weave the noose around both their necks. "If I go down for the poison, you go down for the robbery," she whispered. "Conspiracy to commit burglary, insurance fraud, and let us not forget the gambling debts. If the police start digging into your finances, you will rot in prison for 10 years. She paused, letting the threat sink in. "So you are going to listen to me. When you can talk again, you are going to say it was an accident. You are going to say you took the pills yourself because you were stressed. You are going to say you mixed them with the wine. You are going to protect me, Brian. Because if you don't, I will tell the police everything. I will tell them it was your idea. I will tell them you forced me to grind the pills. Who do you think they will believe? The grieving wife or the gambling addict who hired criminals to rob his own father?" The venom in her voice was palpable. She wasn't just threatening him, she was breaking him. She was using his paralysis, his helplessness to imprint her narrative onto his mind. "We are in this together, till death do us part. Remember," she said, a cruel mockery of their vows. "Now close your eyes and stop looking at me like that. We have to wait for the old man to come back. We have to figure out where he really hid the money. Because if we don't pay by Friday, the sharks aren't going to care that you are in a coma. They will come here and finish the job." I heard her footsteps retreat to the chair. I took the earbud out and placed it carefully in my pocket. I had it. I had the admission of the robbery. I had the motive. I had the threat. And most importantly, I knew that the bond between them was shattered. Fear was the only thing holding them together now. And fear is a brittle glue. I stood up and threw the empty coffee cup into the trash. It was time to go back in. It was time to play the concerned father while I prepared to burn their world to the ground. Vanessa thought she had silenced her husband. She didn't realize she had just handed me the microphone. The legal notice arrived at my hotel suite with the speed of a guillotine blade. It was an emergency motion for temporary guardianship filed ex parte, meaning they were trying to seize control of my life before I even had a chance to put on my shoes. Vanessa wasn't wasting time waiting for Brian to wake up and get his story straight. She was doubling down. She needed access to my accounts, and she needed it now before the loan sharks decided to collect on their grisly collateral. I met Reynolds at the courthouse an hour later. The hearing was taking place in the chambers of Judge Sterling, a man known for his impatience with family disputes, but his soft spot for the elderly. Vanessa was already there, sitting next to a slick lawyer I recognized from the billboards on the highway. She was wearing a modest gray dress, no jewelry, and minimal makeup. She looked like the picture of a concerned, heartbreakingly devoted daughter-in-law. When I walked in, she didn't look at me with hatred. She looked at me with a practiced pity that made my stomach turn. "Your Honor," Vanessa's lawyer began, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "We are here because Mr. Douglas Miller is in immediate danger. He is suffering from acute delusional episodes. He believes he has millions of dollars buried in the woods. He wanders into dangerous environments during storms. We have video evidence of his deteriorating mental state." They played the clip on a large monitor mounted on the wall. I watched myself on the screen, and I had to admit her editing skills were impressive. She had cut out the hours of her screaming and digging. She had cut out her own greed. What remained was a clip of me standing in the pouring rain, holding an umbrella, and pointing vaguely at a tree while muttering about a barn that didn't exist. In the video, I looked lost. I looked frail. I looked like a man whose mind had snapped. See here, the lawyer paused the video on a frame where I was staring blankly at the mud. He dragged a 70-year-old woman out into a storm to dig for imaginary treasure. He endangered her life and his own. He is hallucinating wealth that does not exist. We are simply asking for emergency powers to freeze his assets and place him in a facility where he can be safe while his son fights for his life in a coma. The judge looked from the screen to me. His brow was furrowed. The narrative was compelling. A senile father, a comatose son, and a daughter-in-law trying to hold it all together. It was the perfect lie, constructed from the very performance I had given her. She was using my own trap against me, weaponizing my acting skills to lock me away. Vanessa dabbed her eyes with a tissue. "We just want him safe, Your Honor," she whispered. "He keeps talking about people coming to kill him. He is paranoid." I sat stone still. I didn't interrupt. I didn't shout that she was a liar. I let the silence stretch in the room, letting the weight of her accusation settle. She thought she had checkmated me. She thought the video was the final nail in my coffin. She didn't know that Reynolds was sitting on a bomb. Reynolds stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't look at Vanessa. He looked at the judge. "Your Honor," Reynolds said, his voice calm and authoritative. "We do not dispute that my client went to the woods. We dispute the context, and we certainly dispute the character of the petitioner. Before you make a ruling on Mr. Miller's mental capacity, we would like to submit a different piece of video evidence, one that speaks to the motivation behind this sudden concern for his safety. Vanessa stiffened. Her lawyer objected, citing relevance, but the judge waved him down. "Show it," the judge ordered. Reynolds plugged his laptop into the system. The screen flickered and changed. Gone was the rainy forest. In its place was the crisp, high-definition black and white feed from the security cameras I had installed in my living room 3 months ago, hidden inside the smoke detectors. The timestamp in the corner read 7:45 p.m. on the night of the dinner, the night I was supposedly having a pleasant family meal. The video showed my front door being kicked in. It showed 3 men in work boots and masks entering my home. But they weren't strangers. One of them pulled off his mask to wipe sweat from his forehead. It was clearly the foreman from Miller Construction, Brian's company. And then the camera angle switched to the exterior feed. There, standing by the truck, directing the men as they hauled my wall safe out the back door, was a man in a wheelchair. It wasn't Brian. It was a man Vanessa had been seen arguing with outside the pharmacy days earlier. The loan shark. The courtroom went silent. On screen, the men loaded the safe into the truck bed. The foreman high-fived the loan shark. Your Honor, Reynolds narrated. While Mrs. Miller was serving her father-in-law wine at her home, her husband's employees were robbing his house. This petition for guardianship isn't about safety. It is a hostile takeover. They failed to find money in the safe, so now they are trying to use this court to get the keys to the bank. Vanessa's face drained of color. She gripped the table, her knuckles white. She looked at the screen, then at the judge, who was staring at her with an expression that had shifted from sympathy to cold suspicion. "This is preposterous," Vanessa's lawyer stammered, but he sounded unsure. The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Motion for temporary guardianship is denied pending a full police investigation into this robbery," the judge ruled, slamming his gavel. "And Mrs. Miller, I suggest you do not leave the jurisdiction." Vanessa looked at me. The pity was gone. The fear was back. She realized that while she was editing a movie, I was documenting a crime. I smiled at her, a small, cold smile. The trap hadn't just snapped shut. It had broken her leg. I rented the Obsidian Room at the top of the city's most exclusive hotel for the occasion. It was a glass-walled fortress in the sky looking down on the glittering, wet grid of Seattle. The invite I sent to Vanessa was simple and capitulating. It said that I was tired of fighting, that I had liquidated the farm property, and that I was ready to settle all family debts to ensure Brian's safety and future. I told her to bring her parents because I wanted witnesses to the transfer of wealth. I wanted her to feel safe. I wanted her to feel triumphant. Vanessa arrived wearing a dress the color of victory, a shimmering crimson silk that probably cost more than my first car. She walked in with her chin high, her parents trailing behind her like proud peacocks. Her mother was eyeing the open bar, and the waiters passing trays of caviar with greedy delight. Vanessa spotted me standing by the window, and she smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a general accepting a surrender. She walked over to me, clutching a glass of champagne. "I am glad you finally came to your senses, Douglas," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Brian would be here, but the doctors said he needs rest before the big celebration. But he knows. I told him you were finally doing the right thing." I looked at her. She really believed she had won. She believed the legal setback at the courthouse was just a bump in the road, and that my fear of the loan sharks had finally broken me. "I did what I had to do, Vanessa," I said, keeping my face impassive. "I couldn't let my son live in fear." "Speaking of which," she whispered, looking around the room, "you said you invited the creditors. Are they here?" I nodded toward a circular table near the back. 3 men sat there. They weren't wearing tuxedos. They were wearing suits that were expensive but ill-fitting, stretched tight across broad shoulders and thick necks. They didn't look like investors. They looked like a demolition crew dressed for a funeral. The man in the middle had a scar running through his eyebrow, and he was watching the room with the dead eyes of a shark. "That is Mr. Volkov and his associates," I said. "I told them I am the primary investor now. I told them they will get their check tonight." Vanessa shivered visibly, but she quickly covered it with a sip of champagne. "Good," she said. "Pay them off. Get them out of our lives. Then we can focus on the house transfer." She walked away to mingle with her parents, telling them loud enough for me to hear how generous I was being, how I was finally stepping up as a grandfather. I watched her work the room. She was radiant. She was confident. She was standing on a trapdoor, and she didn't even know I had my hand on the lever. The room filled up. I had invited a few of my old colleagues from the bank, risk assessors and fraud investigators, men and women, who knew how to spot a lie from a mile away. I introduced them to Vanessa as family friends. She didn't care who they were as long as they were there to see her victory. The air in the room was thick with anticipation. The loan sharks were drinking vodka straight, staring at Vanessa. Her parents were eating lobster tails, oblivious to the tension coiling in the corners of the room. I checked my watch. It was time. I signaled the waiter to cut the music. The jazz quartet faded into silence. The murmur of conversation died down. I walked to the small stage at the front of the room where a podium and a large projection screen were set up. I adjusted the microphone. The feedback whine made a few people wince. "Welcome, everyone," I said, my voice booming through the speakers. "Thank you for coming on such short notice. We are here to celebrate a new chapter for my son Brian and his wife Vanessa." Vanessa beamed from the front row, clutching her mother's hand. She looked ready to receive a giant novelty check. "We are here to settle debts," I continued. "We are here to bring everything into the light. Vanessa has been telling me for weeks that money is the only thing standing between our family and happiness. She told me that if I just paid the price, everything would be resolved. So tonight, I am going to pay the price." I saw Volkov lean forward at the back table. He looked interested. Vanessa looked ecstatic. "But before I sign the check, I think it is important for everyone here, especially our new business partners from the construction financing sector, to understand exactly what we are paying for. I believe in transparency. I believe in showing the receipts." I pulled a small remote from my pocket. Vanessa's smile faltered slightly. She wasn't expecting a presentation. She was expecting a wire transfer. I pressed the button. The screen behind me flared to life. It wasn't a photo montage of Brian's childhood. It wasn't a picture of the happy couple. It was a bank statement. A very specific digital receipt blown up to 10 feet tall. The room went deadly silent. The header on the statement read, "Dark Web Marketplace Escrow." The line item highlighted in red was for a purchase made 3 weeks ago. The item description was technical, but I had added a helpful translation in bold text. Succinylcholine, neuromuscular blocking agent, lethal dose. Below the item was the shipping address. It wasn't the pharmacy where Vanessa worked. It was a P.O. box registered to Vanessa Miller. I saw Vanessa turn the color of ash. Her hand flew to her mouth. Her parents squinted at the screen, confused. "This is the first investment Vanessa made," I said calmly into the microphone. "She bought poison to murder her father-in-law. She ground it into my wine. But she made a mistake. She gave it to her husband instead. That is why Brian is in a coma. Not because of a seizure, but because his wife tried to kill me to get my house." A gasp rippled through the room. My former colleagues were nodding. They recognized the evidence. They saw the paper trail. Vanessa stood up, shaking her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a lie," she screamed, her voice shrill and terrified. "He is lying. He is senile." I didn't argue. I just clicked the button again. The screen changed. Now it was a video. The grainy black and white footage from my living room security camera. It showed Brian's foreman and the men sitting at the back table carrying my safe out of my house. And here is the second investment I narrated. While I was at dinner, the men sitting at table 4 were kind enough to remodel my home. They were looking for cash to pay off Brian's gambling debt. I looked directly at Volkov. He wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at Vanessa. His face was a mask of dark fury. He realized he had been exposed. He realized he had been used. But the best part is yet to come, I said, because Vanessa told me these men were going to kill Brian if I didn't pay. She told me she was a victim. I clicked the button a third time. This was the kill shot. A series of text messages projected clear as day. They were texts between Vanessa and a number I had traced back to Volkov's burner phone. Text 1. From Vanessa. The old man is stubborn. He won't sign. Text 2. From Vanessa. Scare him. Hurt Brian if you have to. Cut off a finger. Make it look real. I need Douglas to panic so he releases the funds. Text 3. From Vanessa. If Douglas dies, the insurance pays out double. Do whatever it takes to get my money. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. I looked at Volkov. He stood up slowly. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Vanessa with the eyes of a man who realized he had been played for a fool. She hadn't just owed him money. She had tried to use him as a weapon against her own family, and in doing so, she had exposed his operation to a room full of witnesses. Vanessa backed away, stumbling over her chair. Her parents recoiled from her as if she were radioactive. "You told them to hurt him," she whispered, looking at the screen. "You told them to hurt Brian." "I didn't tell them anything." "Vanessa," I said, my voice cold. "You did. Those are your texts. That is your number. You were willing to mutilate your husband to get my money." Vanessa looked around the room. She saw the disgust on the faces of my colleagues. She saw the horror on her parents' faces. And then she saw Volkov walking toward her, not with a check, but with clenched fists. She realized then that there was no money coming. There was no house. There was no inheritance. There was only the truth and the consequences she had been running from. She turned to run, but the doors to the obsidian room opened. They didn't open for waiters. They opened for the squad of police officers I had stationed in the hallway waiting for my signal. Henderson walked in first, pointing a finger at Volkov, and then at Vanessa. "That is them," he barked. "Those are the ones." The room erupted into chaos, but I stood still on the stage watching the house of cards collapse. I had promised to settle all debts tonight, and I always keep my promises. The atmosphere in the obsidian room shifted instantly from awkward tension to primal violence. Volkov did not scream. He did not throw a tantrum. He simply moved with the terrifying kinetic energy of a man who realized he had been led into a cage. He kicked the table aside, sending crystal flutes shattering against the wall. The sound was like a gunshot, causing Vanessa's mother to shriek and dive under a tablecloth. Volkov walked toward Vanessa. He ignored the other guests. He ignored me standing on the stage. His focus was entirely on the woman in the red dress who had promised him a payout and delivered an indictment. "You told me the old man was paying." Volkov growled, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the floorboards. "You told me this was a celebration. You brought me here to be filmed." Vanessa stumbled backward, her heels catching on the carpet. She held her hands up, palms out, a pathetic gesture of defense against a man who broke bones for a living. "I didn't know," she stammered, tears streaming down her face, ruining the expensive makeup she had applied for her victory lap. "He tricked me. He told me he had the money. Please, Mr. Volkov, we can work this out. I can sell the car. I can sell my rings." Volkov laughed, a harsh barking sound. "Your rings are fake, Vanessa. Just like you. And now my face is on a screen. My business is exposed. You didn't just cost me money, you cost me my anonymity, and for that the price is higher than cash." He reached out and grabbed her by the throat. It happened so fast that no one had time to react. He lifted her off her feet, her legs kicking uselessly in the air, her hands clawing at his thick wrist. Her face turned a mottled purple, matching the bruise blooming on her neck. The guests were screaming now, scrambling toward the exits, but the doors were blocked. That was the signal. I nodded to Henderson, who was standing by the service entrance. He kicked the doors open. "Police! Drop him! Get on the ground! Now!" A dozen tactical officers flooded the room, their weapons drawn, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of command. The raid was precise and overwhelming. They didn't just come for the assault. They came for the conspiracy. Volkov dropped Vanessa. She hit the floor hard, gasping for air, clutching her throat. Before Volkov could reach for the gun I knew he carried in his waistband, 3 officers tackled him. They slammed his face into the parquet floor, zip-tying his hands behind his back. The other loan sharks were on their knees, hands on their heads, surrendering without a fight. Vanessa tried to crawl away. She tried to blend into the crowd of terrified guests. She looked like a broken doll, dragging herself across the floor. Vanessa Miller, a detective, shouted, stepping into her path. "You are under arrest for the attempted murder of Douglas Miller, the attempted murder of Brian Miller, and conspiracy to commit extortion." He pulled her up roughly, snapping the cuffs onto her wrists. The cold metal clicking shut was the most satisfying sound I had heard in years. "It wasn't me," she screamed, thrashing against the detective's grip. "It was Brian. Brian did it all. I am a victim." "Look at my neck. He attacked me." She looked at her parents, who were huddled in the corner, shaking. "Mom. Dad, tell them I am a good person." Her father looked at her. He looked at the screen where her text messages were still frozen, demanding the mutilation of her husband. He looked at the loan shark being dragged away. And then he turned his back on her. I watched it all from the stage. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I just watched the justice system dismantle the life of the woman who tried to end mine. The room was a wreck. The party was over. But I had one last thing to show them. I tapped the microphone. The feedback squeal cut through the noise, silencing the room one last time. "Wait," I said. "Before you take her away, there is one loose end she will try to pull. She will say it is circumstantial. She will say I poisoned the wine." I stepped down from the stage and walked toward Reynolds, who was holding a sealed evidence bag. Vanessa froze. She looked at the bag. She recognized the white handkerchief inside, now dried and stained brown with old wine. "You accused me of switching the glasses, Vanessa," I said, my voice carrying across the room. "You told the paramedics I poisoned Brian. You thought that because you washed the glasses in the sink before the ambulance arrived, the evidence was gone. You thought the only poison was in Brian's blood, and you could blame that on his own hand." I took the bag from Reynolds. "But you forgot that I am a risk assessor. I never go into a volatile situation without an insurance policy." I held up the bag. "This is the handkerchief I used to wipe the table after Brian collapsed. It soaked up the spilled wine. The wine from the glass you handed to me." Reynolds stepped forward, opening a file folder. He pulled out a document with the logo of the State Forensics Lab. "We ran a rush DNA and toxicology screen," Reynolds announced, reading from the paper. "The liquid on this cloth contains a lethal concentration of succinylcholine. But that is not all. The rim of the glass left an impression on the cloth. And on that impression, we found epithelial cells, touch DNA." I walked up to Vanessa. She was trembling so hard her teeth were chattering. "The DNA on the glass belongs to 2 people," I said softly. "Me, because I touched it to switch them. And you, Vanessa, because you prepared it. You ground the pills. You put the ice in. Your skin cells are mixed with the poison. It is a biological signature. You signed your work. Vanessa's knees gave out. The detective had to hold her up. She stared at the handkerchief as if it were a holy relic that burned her eyes. The science didn't lie. The text messages were bad. The video was damning. But the DNA was the coffin lid slamming shut. She looked at me one last time. There was no hate left in her eyes. There was no greed. There was only the hollow, empty look of a person who realizes they have ceased to exist in the free world. "Get her out of here," I said, turning my back on her, as they dragged her out, weeping and pleading with a God she didn't believe in. I looked at the screen one last time. I turned off the projector. The room went dark. The show was over. My son was in a coma he might never wake up from, and his wife was going to prison for putting him there. I had won the war, but looking at the wreckage of my family, I realized that in a war like this, nobody really wins. You just survive. And survival has a cost. I walked out of the hotel and into the night, ready to pay the bill. The visiting room at the state penitentiary was a study in gray. Gray walls, gray floors, gray jumpsuits. The air smelled of industrial cleaner and stale despair. I sat on a metal stool bolted to the floor, waiting. When the door on the other side opened, a guard led Brian in. He was shuffling his ankles, shackled his wrists, cuffed to a belly chain. He looked 20 years older than the man who had laughed at my dinner table just a few months ago. The cocky, desperate gambler was gone. In his place was a hollow shell, a man who had lost everything, including his freedom. He sat down, picking up the black phone receiver. I did the same. The glass between us was thick, scratched by the wedding rings of 1,000 heartbroken wives and mothers. "Hello, Brian," I said. He didn't look me in the eye. He stared at the counter between us. "Why did you come?" he asked, his voice raspy. The tube from the ventilator had scarred his throat, leaving him with a permanent rasp. "I came to say goodbye," I replied. "And I came because you asked my lawyer a question. You wanted to know how I knew." He looked up then. His eyes were watery, red-rimmed. "Yeah," he whispered. "How did you know?" "Vanessa said she was careful. She said you didn't see her crush the pills. She was careful with the poison," I admitted, "but she was careless with the presentation." I leaned closer to the glass. "Do you remember when you were 10 years old, Brian? I took you to that fancy Italian restaurant for your birthday. You wanted to put ice in your grape juice because it was hot. I told you then that we don't put ice in good drinks because it dilutes the flavor." Brian frowned, a flicker of a memory surfacing through the fog of his misery. "I never drink red wine with ice, Brian," I said. "Never. It ruins the bouquet. It shocks the tannins. It is a cardinal sin for anyone who appreciates wine. Vanessa knew that. You knew that. But that night, she put 3 cubes in my glass. I paused, letting it sink in. She wasn't trying to cool the wine. She was trying to hide the sediment. She needed the agitation of the melting ice to dissolve the powder faster. It was a shortcut, a lazy, sloppy shortcut. And that is what killed you. Not the poison. The laziness." Brian closed his eyes. A single tear leaked out and tracked through the stubble on his cheek. "It was just ice," he muttered. "All of this. Over ice." "It wasn't just ice," I corrected him. "It was the fact that you didn't say anything. You saw her hand me a glass that you knew I wouldn't like, and you stayed silent because you were too busy texting your friends to rob my house. You were so focused on the money you forgot who your father was. I didn't want you to die, Dad." He sobbed, his forehead resting against the glass. We were so deep in the hole. They were going to hurt us. I thought if you just went to sleep, it would be painless. I thought it was mercy." "Mercy," I repeated, tasting the bitterness of the word. "You call stripping my home and burying me in a pauper's grave mercy? No, Brian. Mercy is what I am doing now. I am letting you live with the knowledge that you did this to yourself." The guard tapped his watch. Time was up. Brian looked at me, panic flaring in his eyes. "Dad, wait. What happens now?" "The lawyer said you sold the house. Where are you going? How will I find you when I get out?" I stood up and hung the phone back on the cradle. I looked at him one last time. I didn't see my son. I saw a stranger who had worn my son's face to betray me. "You won't," I said through the glass, though I knew he couldn't hear me. I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. The trial had been a spectacle, a media circus that fed on the details of the rich pharmacist who tried to murder her father-in-law. Vanessa turned on Brian the moment the plea deals were offered. She painted herself as a battered wife forced into crime by a gambling addict husband. But the jury didn't buy it. The text messages I had projected at the party were too damning. Her own words demanding violence, demanding death, echoed in the courtroom like a bell toll. Vanessa was sentenced to 25 years for 2 counts of attempted murder, conspiracy, and extortion. The judge called her cold, calculating, and devoid of remorse. When the verdict was read, she didn't cry. She just looked at me across the courtroom with dead shark-like eyes. She knew the game was over. Brian got 15 years. His lawyer managed to argue that he was under duress from the loan sharks. But the video of him laughing, while my house was being robbed, destroyed any sympathy the jury might have had. He was an accomplice, a conspirator, and a thief. The loan sharks, Volkov and his crew, were indicted on federal racketeering charges. My testimony, combined with the evidence I had stockpiled in my basement for 20 years, helped the FBI dismantle their entire operation in the Pacific Northwest. They wouldn't be cutting off anyone's fingers for a long time. After the sentencing, I went back to the house one last time. It was empty now. I had hired a company to liquidate everything. The furniture, the books, the paintings. I didn't want any of it. It all smelled like betrayal. I walked through the empty rooms, listening to my footsteps echo on the hardwood. I stopped in the dining room where we used to have Christmas dinners. I stopped in the kitchen where I used to make pancakes on Sunday mornings. I felt the ghosts of the past tugging at my sleeves, begging me to stay, begging me to remember the good times. But the good times were a lie. They were just the prelude to the poison. I sold the house to a young couple with a baby on the way. They were excited. They talked about knocking down walls and planting a garden. I signed the papers without a second thought. I took the check, a substantial sum that added to the fortune I had already amassed, and I walked away. I didn't look back at the peeling paint or the overgrown lawn. It wasn't my home anymore. It was just a building where a man used to live before he woke up. I took the money and I bought freedom. Not a new mansion, not a yacht. I bought a top-of-the-line recreational vehicle, a 40-foot rolling fortress with solar panels, satellite internet, and a fishing boat hitched to the back. I downsized my life from 3,000 square feet to 300, and I had never felt richer. 3 months later, I was parked by a crystal-clear lake in Montana, the mountains reflecting in the water like a jagged crown. The air was crisp and smelled of pine needles and wood smoke. I sat in a folding chair by the water's edge, a fishing rod in one hand and a cup of black coffee in the other. Henderson was sitting next to me. He had sold his place too. He said the neighborhood was too quiet without me, and besides, he had always wanted to see the Grand Canyon. We were 2 old soldiers, one from the military and one from the corporate wars, enjoying the peace we had fought for. "You think they are biting today?" Douglas Henderson asked, tipping his hat back. "I think they are thinking about it," I said, watching the bobber dance on the ripples. Fish are smart. They know when something is too good to be true. My phone buzzed on the small table between us. I picked it up. The screen lit up with a notification. Incoming call. State Correctional Facility. Collect. I stared at the screen. It was Brian. Or maybe it was Vanessa using her one phone call to beg, to threaten, to try to spin one last web. It didn't matter. I looked at Henderson. He saw the caller ID. He didn't say anything. He just took a sip of his coffee and looked out at the mountains. I thought about answering. I thought about hearing his voice one last time, hearing him apologize, hearing him ask for money for the commissary. But then I remembered the laughter. I remembered the ice. I remembered the shovel in the mud. I didn't decline the call. That would be an interaction. That would be a response. Instead, I popped the back of the phone open. I pulled out the battery. Then I slid out the small SIM card, the chip that connected me to the world I had left behind. I held it up to the sunlight. It was such a small thing to hold so much pain. I snapped it in half. The plastic crunched satisfyingly. I threw the pieces into the lake. They hit the water with a tiny plip and sank spiraling down into the dark, cold depths where the light couldn't reach them. Who was that, Henderson asked, though he knew. Wrong number, I said. Just a telemarketer trying to sell me something I don't need. I cast my line back into the water. The reel sang a high, sweet note. We sat there in silence as the sun dipped below the peaks, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that didn't taste of hospitals or courtrooms. I was 70 years old. I had no family. I had no address, but for the first time in my life, I was free. And that, my friends, is how you survive a poisoning. You don't just switch the glasses. You switch the life. If you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and subscribe for more tales of justice served cold. And remember, always check your wine before you drink. You never know who put the ice in. This ordeal taught me a brutal but necessary truth. Blood is not a binding contract for abuse. For years, I confused enabling with parenting, thinking my financial support would eventually buy my son's character. It didn't. It only bought his entitlement. The most valuable asset I possess isn't the money I buried or the house I sold. It is my intuition. Trusting your gut can save your life when those closest to you plot your demise. Real freedom begins the moment you stop lighting yourself on fire to keep ungrateful people warm. Sometimes walking away is the only victory that matters. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of justice served cold. And tell me in the comments, at what point would you have cut ties with Brian?